everyone, welcome back to Powerful Nothing, a Magic the Gathering Cube podcast. I'm your host, Dan, better known on the internet as 2Sweet MTG, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, James. How's it going, man? Are you well? Happy New Year?
I'm well. Moving is completed. We have a new flat. It's a new year. It's good times.
Awesome, yes. You've had, I'll be honest, I've had quite a nice, relaxing time off in between Christmas and New Year. You've moved house and have been fairly busy, so well done with all that. Glad you're all settled now.
Yeah, I'm so done with DIY, man. It's horrendous. I'm not good at it.
How was moving the Magic collection? Was that like? Because I've moved myself and I've helped move friends before, and like there was one friend who literally had like a sack of Magic cards.
It's so disorganized. It's so funny. There's just so many deck boxes full of disparate selections of cards, like a third of an old standard deck and 2/3 of a modern deck from 2019. You know, it's like no one needs this.
No, fair. Yeah. Moving can be stressful, but yeah, I'm glad the playables are okay. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
We will not be doing a podcast on how to organize your Magic collection because I'm not a model to follow.
No, reasonable. No, but we have an awesome episode for you, for everyone today. Today, we're going to be talking about how to play all 5 colors in Cube. This is one that, I'll be honest, James, if I could define you as an archetype, I think, I'm not going to say a greedy mana base, but like a splashing for some powerful cards is something I think of when I think of you. And I think this is going to be a fun episode because I think I'm going to learn something from this as well, because I've seen you pull together some very awesome and cool decks using this kind of strategy. So, James, you kind of want to give us a bit of an introduction of what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about playing all 5 colors in Cube.
For sure. So, we've done archetype deep dive sort of things in the past, where we're focusing on a more sort of close knit, well defined archetype, something like the Animator or White Weenie. This isn't that. Because 5 color decks can do a million different things in Cube, and we certainly aren't going to be able to list them all exhaustively. What this is going to be, I hope, is a general approach to drafting multicolor decks, which I think applies pretty well in the majority of fairly typical cubes. And obviously, given guides, they're going to break down it a bit in the more sort of niche, weird, wacky cubes. But I think this is going to be an approach to drafting multicolor decks that should be pretty applicable in most cubes.
No, definitely. And I think before we kind of jump into things, I think it's worth kind of clearing up that when we say 5 color, we're not running like in our 17 land mana base, we're not running like 3 of every basic. We are being good here. We are drafting our lands and to an extent, it's not like a full 5 color mana base. It's another way of describing this, James, kind of like the art of splashing, would you say?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there certainly are decks where you get to the point where you are like legit 5 color, but that's pretty rare. But mostly what happens is you have like 1 to 2 base colors, and that's where your cheap cards are concentrated, and you splash everything else. And obviously, it's not like this guide only applies if you're playing the full 5. Like, obviously, a bunch of time you'll end up like 2 and 2 splashes, or like solidly 3 color with 1 splash, or whatever. But yeah, this is a guide of how to cast a lot of good spells across a wide variety of colors.
Awesome. So let's jump into this. I guess a good place to start, James, is why do you want to draft, or why draft 5 colors? Why draft all these colors? Why draft your lands? Why are we doing this?
So I think for me, the biggest draw to playing a lot of colors is that most cubes you play will have some of what I call like a power outlier. It's like a card that gives you way more than you expect to get for that mana cost in the cube that you are playing. So to use like Vintage Cube as an example, which we can do a lot, but just because that is a cube that people know and understand, and therefore the examples make sense, not because that's the only cube it applies to. But to use Vintage Cube as an example, it's cards like Minskamboo, cards like Psychic Frog, Forfeolingus. These are so far above the comparable things you could get in other colors. These are these like dwarf the competition and power level, right? It's not a small upgrade above your what you might be playing him otherwise. It's like night and day. And listen, everyone is going to take these cards early in the first pack. You're not going to get like pack 1, pick 5, Minsk and Boo unless your table is doing some things wrong. But because people are going to see it and move in. But in pack 3, a lot of people can't cast a Minsk and Boo. They're going to open it up, look at their Dimir mana base, and pass it along. And you can very easily get like pack 3, pick 4, or pick 5, even Minsk and Boo. And that's a lot of the draw you get from playing a lot of colors, because you get to play all the busted cards you see. Outside of obviously things that are like triple pipped or whatever, you're not really going to be able to play. But you get to play way more of the busted cards than everyone else, and you don't really care what colors of cards you open. You just need them to be powerful, and that can be a really great place to be. The other nice thing is, even if you end up with like 1 to 2 base colors, you often don't need to pick those colors until very late in the draft, which is really powerful, right? Because you've spent your early picks on the busted, splashable, powerful cards, on fixing, cheap interaction, which can go in regardless of what your base color is, you can play those cards. And then later in the draft, when it's really clear that, green is the open color, you can then have green as your base color. Or if it turns out that red is open, then red can be your base color. But you don't have to commit to those things early, because all your early picks are going to be cards that end up in your deck and make it meaningfully better, like almost no matter where you end up.
Just to clarify there, when you say your early picks, are you referring to just like picks, like the first pack, just highly prioritizing lands? Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always a process as to how you end up here, right? It's not like you're going into a draft saying, right, I'm going to be 4 or 5 colors in this draft. But often what you do is you take, say, a fetch land early, because fetch lands are great, and then you see another fetch, and then you see something splashable, and you're maybe like moving around between the colors, and if you're just prioritizing the fixing, then you're in a nice spot, because if 2 of those colors are really open, then you just move into them. But if you're not getting that incredibly strong signal, you can just keep taking fixing, taking powerful cards, and you end up in a really good place where you're able to cast the powerful cards you already have and take advantage of the ones you see later.
No, fantastic. That's great. Yeah, I can definitely see that one reason that this archetype is going to be strong is that you're just more likely to just be playing the cards you've drafted, because the lands are going to make your deck, and then you're playing a bunch of busted spells afterwards. That's awesome. We will jump into like the how in a bit more detail in a moment, but I'm assuming it can't all be great, James. There must be some downsides to just spending the first couple of picks just picking lands. I'm assuming like you might be passing some powerful spells. What are the downsides, James, of drafting a lot of colors specifically and drafting your lands early?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, you're spending some high picks on lands. To be clear, you shouldn't be taking the lands over busted spells. You should, because the busted spells are why you're here, but you should be taking like fetch lands really highly. Your bar to what you take over a fetch land should be very, very high. And you're prioritizing the good fixing over like the solid playable cards. And that certainly has some downsides. Like if you end up full on 5 color, like not just minor splashes, like you are legitimately playing all the colors, you're probably going to end up wanting to play somewhere in the region of like 5 basics. But the issue is you only get to draft 45 cards. So that means that you only get to leave 10 cards in your sideboard. So obviously, you basically don't have a sideboard, right? That is just not going to be an option for you. And B, you kind of just can't afford to miss on that many packs. If you see too many... Now, you can manage that because, you can cast all the spells. So it's much harder for you to miss on packs. But you still do get the odd pack that's all like combo cards and mopey aggro 1-drops that you can't use, right?
Or I guess as well, to an extent, also just cards that are slightly harder to cast, because like ideally in your deck, you're not going for like double pip spells, but like that could be one of the things that you get stung by.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great point. Like it's the sort of deck where, like, especially the cheap cards that are double pipped, you really want to stay away from. Like Counterspell, for example, very powerful card. Generally, I'm not that interested if I'm playing a lot of colors, unless I'm like very much base blue splashing everything else. And then the other issue you're going to run into is you're going to have quite a lot of lands that come into play tapped.
Yes.
You can manage this. Like, you're prioritizing the untapped lands higher, and then you're also very heavily prioritizing like 1 mana interaction is great, right? Because that it makes your tap lands feel okay, right? If you go tap land into tap land, bolt your guy, that's actually fine. You've not fallen that far behind.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go tap land into tap land, and then my first spell is players on turn 3, that's kind of a disaster.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter what speed of the cube that is. 2 to 3 tap lands in a row is kind of just like, that's kind of good games no matter what you're doing. But so just on that as well, I'm like, we are assuming when you are doing this strategy, the cube is balanced. There is a good mix of aggro, tempo, control, combo, that kind of stuff. If it is a faster leaning cube, to say, I'm assuming that this is potentially a archetype that is going to not be as strong as a cube where things are more balanced. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, if everything's like aggro with like 8/1 drops creatures, then you might be in trouble, right? I mean, it depends. Hopefully there are like tools that let you catch up from that, and you get to play the tools that you see. If the cube's wildly unbalanced and skewed in favor of aggro, then yeah, you probably shouldn't play tap lands in your deck, and just play 1 to 2 colors and meet fire with fire. But it can be. The nice thing, right, about playing a lot of colors is that you do get access to the tools that you see to fight the aggro stuff. Like, this can be a deck where sweepers work really well, but also just like that 1 mana interaction again is really crucial here. But yeah, generally what you really want to play against for like mid-rangey decks of fewer colors, right? Because you're just going to have higher card quality, and in a longer game, you're just going to outpower them.
Yes, this seems like the definition of being 1 step slower, but 1 step more powerful than like every other deck there. Basically, this seems like the epitome of that. Cool. So, what would you say a typical 5-ish or a heavily splashing deck look like, James? I'm assuming this has changed over the last couple of years with printings, with things like triomes, with more cards like you mentioned, like Minsk and Boo, like Fourth Airlingus, kind of powerful cards that are like single mana pips, but 2 different colors in them. Kind of like, how does this deck look like, James? What would you say?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very different. Like, basically, to like what these decks look like, sort of pre-Modern Horizons, is a completely different ballpark. Because how 5-color decks used to play in powerful cubes was they got access to all the great interaction and card draw, and they just played out as control decks, right? You'd have swords and mana drain and pyroclasms and stuff, and you'd deal with their early threats, and then you'd cast like, I don't know, Niv Mizzet Reborn or one of these nonsense cards and go from there. And you'd be playing like a bunch of talismans and stuff, right? That's not really the way it works anymore, because it used to be that the power outliers we were talking about were the like mana drain and stuff, right? Now it's not that really. It's the power outliers of Minsk and Boo and Psychic Frog. It's really shifted towards the threats as being the black cards. So we've gone very much from like counter your spell, kill your guy, play a card, draw a spell, play a 15-turn game, to like, bolt your dude, spell pierce your thing, here's my Minsk and Boo, you're dead, is really more the approach you're trying to take a lot of the time in these really powerful cubes with the 5-color decks now.
I mean, the thing you just said of kill their dude, play your threat, win the game, that used to be 3 different cards. Now you've just described Minsk and Boo.
Yeah,
just described Oko or something like that. Yeah.
What if instead of playing a card draw spell, my card draw spell was for Fairlingus and you're already dead?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm also assuming they kind of we haven't really touched on the initiative yet, but I'm assuming the initiative is really good in these type of archetypes as well, because all the good ones are only a single pip, which from what we've discussed, they fit in really well. And also, I mean, the first stage of the initiative is find a land. I'm assuming the initiative is very strong in these kind of decks.
I'd say yes, it is, but you have to be careful. You're right, they're very powerful and they're very splashable. The downside is you have to be really well set up to keep the initiative, because often the thing is, right, you're not going to have as many creatures as the really aggressive decks.
Right, okay.
So if you can't kill that guy and you lose the initiative, it can be quite difficult to get it back. Obviously, it gets way better if you have like hasty threats to follow it up, which you certainly can have access to. But you can definitely end up in spots where it's like you lose the initiative because they had like a haste when you didn't expect it or whatever, and then you're just looking at your hands and it's like, yeah, I can kill your guys forever, but I can't actually take it back. And if you can kill my guy, then I may be in trouble. So I'd say yes, it's great, but you have to be confident that you have enough of a cheap interaction or enough haste threats to take that initiative back, but you actually want to be fighting that fight, you know? Sometimes you can get to the end of a draft, look at your deck and be like, is the initiative actually something I want to be introducing into this game? You know, maybe not. And obviously, it depends as well on like which initiative threat you're talking about. Something like Feywild Caretaker, which really helps you protect the initiative as well as getting it, is really great here. Where something maybe like Undermountain Adventurer can be a little less so, because it's just a dude on the ground, right? And if they have a way to get around that, then they can take the initiative back from you.
One of the things that I want to touch on in terms of power level is that, to an extent, this as a archetype, as it were, this kind of deck can, in theory, appear in any power level of cube if the lands are good enough, because effectively you're playing the best cards in multiple colors. Therefore, it doesn't matter if you're in a pauper cube, if you're in a legacy cube or a vintage cube. You're just going to adjust to whatever the best things are. I'm assuming, James, like, yeah, as you mentioned, fetch lands, but kind of like specifically, like, is it fetch lands and like fetchable jewels are like a must for this archetype to exist? And I guess when I say fetchable jewels, I don't just mean ABR jewels. I do mean like you could have like surveil lands or check lands in there as well. It's kind of like is that kind of combination of just being able to have one land, find your splash, is that the key to including this archetype in a cube?
I think it's certainly one of them. If you don't have fetchers and fetchable jewels, then it might be harder to get down the fixing just with lands. You might be looking at going into like talismans or things like prophetic prism or the green stuff with rampant growth or whatever to launch your fixing. I think if you want to get there off just lands, I mean, obviously it depends on how the cube is built, but I'd say it's going to be much harder if you don't have access to like the possibility, at least, of like fetch lands and fetchable jewels or triumphs.
That's fair, and I'm also assuming it's hard. The way you've described potentially getting into this archetype of early taking some either some interaction or there just not being an exciting card and taking like doing the bread and butter, taking a fetch land, that kind of stuff. That's harder to fall into, as it were, in a cube without those kind of things, because it's like, to an extent, like I can rationalize to myself taking a fetch land over like a mid-powered level threat, but like taking a signet or a mid-power level threat in like a more budget cube, that's a bit trickier, I think. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. But the things as well, like getting the fixing is kind of only half of the puzzle, right? It also needs to be worth your while to play all these colors. You need those really powerful cards to splash, and it can also be a thing in some lower power level cubes. Definitely not all, but some of them, it's like the juice kind of isn't worth the squeeze, because
I could see that maybe in like Peasant or Pauper, just because they don't tend to pin like probably don't print that many like tricolor commons. Like I can think of like maybe in like Khans or like Nuka Pen, like actual 3-color sets, but just generally you don't see them as much as like but generally a lot of sets will have like a cool 3-color rare in it, that kind of stuff. So just card pool might be an issue when it comes to lower powered level cubes.
I was gonna say on that, there's not as many powerful gold cards, but there's also in some cubes, it's just the whole power level of the cube is much flatter.
Right. Okay. Right. It's specifically the outliers we're talking about that makes it worthwhile. Right.
Exactly. Because a lot of the upside of drafting is deck right. It's not just that you get to play the gold cards. It's also like if you see an Orcish Bowmaster, you get to take it, and if you get to see an Ancestral Recall, you get to take it. Right. It's having those real outliers on the power, and if you're in a cube where the power level is just pretty flat, then there's kind of just fewer reasons to do this, because you'd be better off just taking solid good cards and more prioritizing like synergy. And that's another thing, right? If a lot of the power level available in the cube is really wrapped up in like synergy decks that exist in sort of 2-color pairs, then a 5-color deck is much less appealing, right? Because it's going to be hard to access those synergies. For this deck to come together, you really want those like cards that work on their own, right? Like what does a Psychic Frog ask of you? Absolutely nothing. It needs you to be able to cast it. And a lot of what you're trying to do with this deck is, here are the like 6 most powerful cards I saw this draft. I took all of them because I can cast all of them. And like, I'm just going to see some of them in all of my games. And that is a lot of what my game is around, right? My goal is to not be dead and cast one of these cards.
It does make sense. That is clicking because in lower power level cubes, I kind of ones that are kind of more trying to replicate the experience of like boosted draft. It is more about the two color archetypes, and like when I built my cube, I was trying to balance things, and I specifically cut power outliers like Minsk and Boo, the Initiative, Fourth Ailing, just because they just, well, to an extent, this deck that we are talking about here just kind of took over my cube. It just won like a Naya mush of Minsk and Boo, Fourth Aelingus, Comet Stellar Pup. Just won everything for so long, and it makes sense in my environment because it was like those were the most powerful cards in there. In Powered Cube, you are also fighting against things like Moxen and like Time Walk and that kind of stuff. But like, I can see just being able to just cast the most powerful cards. Yeah, I have lived it, James. I can see that. Yeah, it's a very strong thing to be doing. Just touching on just coming back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of going back to kind of like what the typical deck will look like. We touched on base color earlier, in terms of often you're likely to start off drafting one color and then kind of with the fixing, you're able to kind of splash into multiple colors, and that's kind of you end up in those other colors. Like, is there, when I think of being one color splashing the rest, I do think green. Is green normally the like center archetype to this? Like, do you think you need like your Birds of Paradises to help with this archetype, or could you be like base white and splashing some other colors if the fixing was good enough, say with like talismans or signets and lands? Kind of like, where do you kind of fall on like base colors, James?
Basically, I find that in a lot of cubes now, you're pretty much able to get all the fixing you want out of your lands. I don't think you need to be in most cubes like base green in order for this deck to work. The base green version certainly can be powerful. It's the only version that's really interested in mana dorks because, obviously, if you're base anything else, your mana dork is only good on turn 1, right? So,
yes, and also don't splash your fixing.
Do not splash your fixing, yeah, for real. But yeah, no, the thing is with the green decks, like, I find the base green 5-color deck, it can be strong, but it plays out very, very differently from the others because green does not really give you access to cheap interaction at all.
Right, okay.
Which basically every other color does, right? To a certain extent. So the base green deck I found to be like actually the most aggressive, like even more than a base red 5-color deck, because you're not really trying to deal with their early threats that much. You're very much like, I have 10 green sources. Here's my noble hierarch. Here's a scary free drop. I go from there. Whereas my sort of default playing these decks is like, I'm gonna play like a couple of interactive spells in the early game, not be too far behind, then start casting my haymakers.
Right, that makes sense.
I find that you can get there just off the lands in a lot of cubes. And which I think is a big difference between most cubes and like most booster draft environments, right? Like,
yes,
often
100%.
in booster draft, you really have to be base green for a 5-color deck to work, because that's where you find all your fixing. But a lot of cubes now just have enough fixing that you can make this archetype work off just lands, especially if the cube has fetchers. Fetchers are unbelievable in these decks. Like, if you have access to a couple of fetchers, your goal should very much be that all of my fetchers get all of my colors, and that's normally pretty achievable.
Yeah, so one of the things with like the base green stuff is like it doesn't just have access to like mana dorks, like Birds of Paradise. It also has access to cards like Rampant Growth, or like if you're in a slower cube, maybe like Cultivate, kind of like cards that can tutor lands from the deck. I'm assuming maybe the ones that get non-basic lands aren't it, but like maybe it's something like Farseek. Is that something you would consider in a 5-color deck if you were doing the, like, if green ended up being your base color?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Farseek's a very powerful fixer if you can get brown green as your base color. And the really nice thing about the land searching fixers, right, is that they just can't get removed. It can be quite awkward if you're really relying on like Birds of Paradise for your fixing, and then they just bolt it, and you're looking at your wide variety of uncastables in your hand. So yeah, the Farseek's really good for that. Also, like, Sylvan Caryatid low-key falls into that category, right? Because they can't kill it. But yeah, I like Farseek. Again, you have to be base green. You want like 9 or 10 green sources. But yeah, it's a powerful card. I would not. In some version of these decks, you're not going to have so many basics that you want to play Cultivate. Like, this kind of sometimes even applies to stuff like Evolving Wilds. Like, sometimes I have like 2 black cards and I don't want to have to play a swamp, which can make stuff like Evolving Wilds a bit of a lower priority. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't take Evolving Wilds. Like, often you take it and you make it work, but it is sometimes a cost if you're relying on ways to search out basics specifically, that you do have to put those basics in your deck.
What about the other colors being your base color? Like how does like white and red and black and blue work as your base colors, James?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Actually, most of these work. Like red, I find works surprisingly well, because you get you get all your busted red free drops, right? And you get cheap interaction in the form of burn spells, which deals with a lot of the stuff that is going to really punish you for playing your tap lands, right? And you get things like Magda, Fable of the Mirrorbreaker. This treasure making is increasingly prominent. That helps cast your cards. Generally, the base red deck is looking to be a bit more assertive. It's not the you're maybe not going to be as deep in all 5 of the colors, but you're going to have like solid red base, and then you're splashing the best cards you see in other colors, right? And I've found that to be a pretty effective strategy. Like, kind of the like big red strategies that people think of, but instead of your top end being like some medium dragon, because that's what you opened, your top end is a Feywild Caretaker, and you've got an Orcish Bowmasters, and you've got a you've got access to all the best cards you see, right? You get a Parallax Wave, you get what you need to fill out the top of your curve, and you end up as sort of, you have a bit of an early aggro plan, and then you can really outpower them later as well, which kind of works out pretty well, I find.
Yeah, another choice. Yeah, I guess red as well has also just got a bunch of really good, just like aggressive but engine cards. I'm thinking like Inti and Lelia that can just like hit your opponent in the face and give you card advantage as well. Like
exactly. The when your 2-drop is also good late, this deck really likes that, right? And Inti does a lot of that. Also, the rummaging can be quite nice because however way you build your mana base, you do occasionally just have hands with this deck that can look kind of silly, right? You look at your opening hand and there's a double white card and no planes. And so having a bit of rummaging just so you can get out of that can be pretty nice as well. Yeah, and then blue is, I think, kind of plays in kind of the opposite way, a bit more of a classic 5-color deck, right? Where you're surviving the early game, countering their cards. And the upside of blue as a base in your 5-color deck is you just see so many cards, right? Like, it is not a meme that divination is fixing, and blue decks do this really well. Like, to a certain extent, you can get away with a lot fewer sources of your other colors if you have like a Ponder and a Preordain, and you just see a lot of cards, right? You're going to find your colors. If you're splashing stuff that you don't need immediately, then by turn 4 or 5, you'll normally have found the colors you need.
I think divination can be fixing, but it's not a land drop. So don't keep like opts and a 1-lander, that kind of stuff. Maybe ancestral in a 1-lander I'll give you, but like as long as the 1-land's blue. But,
yeah, that does help.
That's right. I guess this does kind of bring us on to a good question of kind of like, in an ideal world, what is our mana base looking like in this? Say we are as we kind of discussed, kind of like we are primarily a 1-color deck, but we're trying to splash at least a card in each color. Say let's say we're mono white as an example, but we're trying to splash like a Chaos Defiler, a Chaos Defiler and an Oko. Okay, let's just go like that is our spread, along with a few other like minor splashes, that kind of stuff. But so to get that 5-color mana base working, what are we looking at? It's kind of like how many basics do you think we're going to be running of our main color? How many dual land? Like ideally here, how many fetches and how many sources of each are we roughly going to have here, James? Because I think that will kind of like help kind of like inform people of like what to look out for when drafting as well, because you need to be making sure that you're generating the mana requirements that your deck needs.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, generally, for it to be, once you've put all this effort into getting a ton of non-basics, right, you're going to have a decent chunk of cards outside your main color. But the main thing is all the cards that you absolutely need to cast in the early game are going to be in that base color, right? And everything that isn't in that base color is at least decent in the mid game. So that means now it will say it's quite different between different cubes where the mid game starts, right? Like in a pauper cube, that might, because it's a lot slower, that might mean I want to have all my colors by turn 5. In a powered cube, really, the mid game starts at turn 3, I think.
Yes.
So it does kind of, if the cube is faster, your mana actually kind of needs to be a little bit better. But yeah, so you want to be able to have, because you always want to have access to that base color in the very early game. So you probably want like minimum 10 sources. Obviously, those aren't all going to be basics. I mean, when you really get there, you tend to have like five basics in your deck total. But there can be a bit of a trade-off here. It sort of depends how many untapped lands you get, right? How much of that you can get away with. But yeah, you want to have that like 9 to 10 sources of your base color, and then the number of sources of your other color is going to depend a bit on how many cards you have in that color and how pip intensive they are. But yeah, really, you want to be able to like reliably have all of your colors, but when you get into the mid game, and
makes sense. And sorry, and so we're counting fetch lands as color sources of any source they can fetch for, correct?
Yeah.
So
Which is,
yeah.
and it's a good point that saying I have a flooded strand that can get a black is not kind of as much of a black source as a swap, right? Because
Yes.
because sometimes you didn't get black. Sometimes when you drew that fetch land, you needed to get a different color, and then you drew your black card later, and you didn't have your black source. But I'm generally looking for, like, say I'm playing 3 black cards. I want to have like 8. I'd say like a loose 8 black sources, because 7 or 8, because like 8 things that can make a black mana. But some of them might be those fetch lands, which sometimes get other things. But that means if I have a black card in my opener, I'm going to be able to play in a way where I normally have access to black. And sure, sometimes I'll draw a black card later, but hopefully, even if I fetch for something else, by the time I draw that black card, I'll have drawn another black source, right? But when we talk through these, this is why those fetches are so crucial, and they're such high picks, because getting them basically as 5 color lands most of the time, that is really how you make these numbers work, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's when your mana base is in front of you, being able to say that this one, like, fetches just count for so many different colors effectively. It's kind of like that's what gets you to that 9, 10 number of each color way easier, is by doing it with is by fetches, because they can fetch the colors of mana that you need, I guess. And one of the things that I've really found important is, like, when you're playing it as well, or before you play it, or one thing I found really important with this is, before you play your game, work out, like, or just have a mental note of what fetches can get what, or like if you're splashing, like how are you getting your splashes into play with those fetch lands? Because say you only have, or say all your fetches can get all of your colors. Actually, no, that's a bad example. What's am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, basically, if only some of your fetches can get some of your colors, if you use those fetches to get other colors, you might not be able to get the, like, if you use the fetches that can get your black source early to not get your black source, then later in the game you're going to be having to rely to draw it, which is not the point of fetches. So there might be times where you might need to, like, go and get a dual, like, go and get a triome early and maybe take a turn off to set yourself up for the rest of the game, so you're not relying on drawing your splash colors. That's not, like, I'm assuming, James, we don't want to be waiting to draw lands here. We want to be fetching for them and being proactive with it.
Exactly. And it's it's the other thing, right, is you need to really be, if you're playing with fetch lands, you need to be really paying attention during the draft about
yes,
which lands you need to take in order to enable those fetches. Like, you don't want to be in the spot where you get to the end of the draft and realize that, like, 2 of your fetch lands don't get 2 of your main colors, and if only you'd taken that Zagoth Triome, that was the thing that knitted it all together, you know? Yeah,
that's kind of the thing with triomes, is that it's also more just a quality of life increase, because it's just more, you're just more likely to hit it off of any fetch lands. And that's something that's going to be easier on Mitgo, because you see all your cards in front of you. In person, in theory, you're not going to be, like, in person depends on the type of group. Like, most casual play groups, you're fine looking at your picks in between, but just, like, having, like, I generally have my mana base at a separate portion to the, like, I have my pile of cards, and I have my mana base to one, like, either at the front or the back, just so I know roughly what I'm working with. Especially if you're kind of, like, thinking of, if you've taken some lands early, working out what you can splash is also going to be important. If you're like you can take all the lands at the start, but if you don't have the colors to take, to make the mana for that Minsc Boo, then you probably shouldn't take it. If you have all the, like, if you can make all colors apart from red, then it's going to be, then you're in the position that everyone else is in. It's harder to take it if you can't cast it, basically.
Yeah, for sure. The nice thing about it's better to be in the spot where you have the fetches and not the jewels than the other way around, right? Because if you have like 3 fetches, then often it's just like 1 triome, and it suddenly solves all your problems, right? If it's the right one. And it is something, you very much, even if you're not looking at your picks, your cards between each pick, look at them at the end of each pack. And is one of the things you want to be thinking about is what colors do these fetches get at the moment? Because if you find that you have a flooded strand that doesn't fetch green and a wooded foothills that doesn't fetch blue, then you realize when you see that breeding pool in the next pack, right, that's actually a very important land for me. That's way more important than some other dual land that I may or may not need, like if in that scenario, the breeding pool is normally I think about it as a dual land sort of adds 1 more colored source to your deck, right? Replacing a forest with a breeding pool adds 1 more source of a color. But if you have the 2 fetches that are getting it, it's kind of adding like 4 more sources, right? It's night and day. And then the other thing you want to be thinking about is what are the cards you are splashing? Because so I think like the archetypal thing for a easily splashable card, right, is something like Forfailingus. Because Forfailingus just gets better and better the longer the game goes on, right? Like I would play a Forfailingus off 3 sources if I had to. Like if I only had 3 white source in my deck, I would probably still play Forfailingus, because even if I don't get there until turn 10, if I've survived until turn 10, Forfailingus will win me the game, right? Whereas something that really needs to be coming down a bit earlier to be powerful, that's going to require you a lot more sources. And it's you want to keep that sort of sliding scale in mind.
Cool. So I think that kind of is a good example of what a 5-color deck looks like. But to actually get it, we have to draft it. So, James, let's talk about how you actually draft a 5-color cube, or a 5-color deck. Because I'm assuming it's not as straightforward as just drafting every land you see under the sun. Kind of like, and also, I guess the other part is kind of like is how we're getting into it in the first place. Because in theory, if we're taking lands early, it's because there haven't been anything else exciting that we're kind of after. Kind of like when you end up in these decks, James, kind of like how are you generally getting there?
So I think there's a few ways. I'm pretty happy taking fetches first or second pick if there's nothing else super exciting for me.
I think if anyone ever asks what was your first pick and it was a fetch land, no one's like, oh, you messed up there. Like everyone's kind of like, yeah, okay, fair, yeah.
Exactly, because the thing is, the fetch land is not just good in the domain deck, right? It's good everywhere. Like the fact that fetches, like each fetch fetches all but one of the triomes, like you're just very likely to end up with that fetch in your deck. So they're good early picks for that reason, but they're at their best in this deck. So yeah, one way is I just take some fetches early. Another way is like, say pack 1, pick 1, you take a Psychic Frog, right? Great pack 1, pick 1, really powerful card. You'll have to see it. And you go to pack 2, and there's the best blue and black cards are like solid but pretty unexciting. Maybe there's like a Cult Epiphany and a Duress and a whatever miscalc, something slightly unexciting. And then there's also a Minsk and Boo hanging out there, right? Or maybe even the black cards are a bit better, But I would advocate for taking the Minsk and Boo in that spot. Because, and I'm not saying you're locking into playing all 4 of those colors in that scenario. What you're saying is this draft could go a lot of different directions from here. If blue and black are really open, then I'll play this Psychic Frog and I'll ignore this Minsk and I'll abandon this Minsk and Boo, and that's fine. If red and green are really open and blue and black aren't, then I'll play the Minsk and Boo and abandon the Psychic Frog. But another way you can go is there's not one incredibly open lane for you, but you see some good fixing and the lands are going quite late in your pod. And then you move into this 5-color space. So you don't, and often the way when you kind of trigger onto that, right, is when it gets like pack 6, pack 7 and like the triome's still there and you're just seeing the lands really late, right? Sometimes you get clued in that like, okay, it feels like everyone else is in like these 2-colory decks, so I'm just going to see a lot more lands because other people won't be prioritizing them that highly. Because the thing is, to make your mana base work for this, like we need a lot of non-basics, and we can't be using all of our really high picks on them because we need to take the powerful cards. So we do need to get our fixing kind of late. So yeah, when generally I'm like speculating early, and then when I start getting the lands really late, that's when I'm like, okay, maybe I can actually be like a 4 or 5 color deck in this draft, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense, because in draft we are generally told to stay open for as long as possible, and like drafting your lands is one of the better ways of doing that. And so it kind of, to an extent, this kind of almost feels like you're just I'm not going to say prolonging the commitment, if that makes sense, but kind of like effectively you're not being like wowed by like it's not like you're seeing like a card that pulls you into a deck. Like you're not seeing like I don't know what, like Tinker came into my mind, but it's not like you're seeing a cool powerful card or like a series of signs that like a specific like deck that you like is open, for example. Like you're not seeing like a Reanimate come through, you're not seeing Sneak Attack, that kind of stuff. You're nothing's really kind of getting like, it's taking your fancy basically, and kind of you're just using those opportunities to garner effectively playables by drafting lands.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that delaying the commitment thing is a lot of why this deck's powerful, right? Because there's also the scenario of like, you think sometimes you think you have a lane and that lane isn't open, right? Like you first pick 4 Phalangus, you second pick a Comet, you're like, right, I'm red white, this deck's going to be busted. And then those colors just aren't open, right? Sometimes the person passed you a Comet because they opened Black Lotus, and then they moved into white, right? And you're just not seeing those Boros cards. And from that point, you can either try desperately to hang on to your Comet and 4 Phalangus and have a lot of really questionable cards in your deck and try and play Boros, or you can abandon those cards and play some other colors that you think are more open, or you can take a bunch of fixing, be like base some other colors, do a lot of splashing, and you still get to have the 2 best cards you've seen in your deck. So that's certainly another way you can end up here, you know.
And then and I'm assuming, James, there can be a risk of, if you're just taking lands, that you might not have enough creatures or spells or effects to actually kind of play Magic, I think is the way I'm going to phrase that.
Yeah, it's the thing. You've got to pay attention.
Yeah, kind of like, yeah. So at what point are you starting to pay attention to that? Is it like after pack 1, or like when realistically do you need to start thinking, right, okay, the fixing is as good as it can be at this point, unless there is like specifically like a triome I need, I'm just taking playables at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's something you want to pay attention to all the way through the draft. You don't want to be getting to the end of pack 2 realizing you have the most incredible mana base in the world and 12 playable spells, because you're just putting a lot of pressure on. Then every pack in pack 3, you've got to be able to take 2 cards, basically, right? You've got to wheel something out of almost every pack. And that's pretty tough. So, yeah, it's something you just need to be aware of. It's like, how many lands have I taken? How many spells have I taken? There's because otherwise, where you end up right is right. It's like, I took these powerful cards that got me into it, and I took these lands so I can cast them all, and that's great. And like the like 5 best cards in my deck are amazing, and I can cast everything really consistently. But like the 5 worst cards in my deck are so unbelievably bad that my bombs don't really compensate for it, you know. So yeah, you've got to pay attention to it through the draft. You've got to always have that balance in mind of how many spells have I taken, how many playables do I have, versus how does my mana look. I will say, like, it's more okay than in other decks to go into pack 3 with with fewer playables, right? Like in a normal, like if I was drafting Boros and I was going into pack 3 with like 14 playable spells, that would be a crisis. That'd be horrendous. I don't think I'm getting there. If my mana base is incredible, I can cast everything, and I have 14 spells going into pack 3. I mean, it's fewer than I'd like, but 9, I can get 9. That means I need to like get a spell out of every pack and then wheel one or two things. That's fine.
I think, as we kind of touched on, in theory, pack 3 is when you're getting hooked up.
Exactly.
That's when, in theory, things are paying off the most, because you will have your lands. In theory, you've eaten your veg first. I know how I often am in cube. Like, the very standard thing is draft a load of broken spells, or draft what you think is a cool deck. Look at your picks after pack 2, and you have like one fetch land, and it's like, well, balls, I need to draft some lands. So kind of like, it does kind of flip in terms of like, you're being rewarded for taking your lands early. Everyone else, in theory, is more likely to give you cards they either know they can't cast or can't pick because they need to take their lands. So
yeah, for sure.
From my experience with this, James, it's kind of like I've generally found, and let me know if things are true, they're kind of like, casting a spell with 2 different pips is often easier than casting a spell with 2 of the same pips. I'm kind of thinking like, casting a Fractured Identity can often be easier than casting a Palace Jailer.
Yeah, it's way easier because partly because of this how fetches work, right? When you're deciding which lands you're fetching, you're prioritizing having one of each, basically, right? Generally before you're looking to have doubles, because that's just going to give you access to majority of cards in your deck. It's not true that like you should never play double pip cards in these decks. Like, if I see a Parallax Wave, I'm going to try and make it work, But you've got to be very wary, and you've got to be disciplined. Sometimes you see them later, and you look at the lands you have available, and it's just like, right, I just don't have that many other green cards, so I don't want to have to play so many green sources in my deck to make this double green card work. And I don't have the amount of fixing I would need to reliably have double green for free, so I'm going to pass this really powerful double green card. And especially double pip cards that you want to have early in the game. Things like Counterspell, like it's generally just not something you're interested in this deck. Like Mana Leak, great. Counterspell, no thank you.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess it's. Is there a thing of though, if it is your primary color, it's. I guess I would consider it if it's in my primary color and it's like a 4, 5, 6 drop. Not the 2 drop, but like if it's like we're not splashing for double pips at any point, are we?
Yeah, I mean the word splash is always, there's a lot of context, right? Because there's all these decks exist on a spectrum. Some of them are very much, I have this one base color and then I'm splashing everything else, and all my splashing's very expensive. Sometimes your mana's just insane, right? Sometimes you have like 4 fetch lands, a bunch of triomes, and you kind of feel like you can cast everything. And at that point, you can, like, sometimes you barely have a base color, right? Sometimes you're just like, right, I think I'm going to be able to get my colors early enough. Sure, some of them are going to be tapped, but I'm going to play like cheap interaction of all these different colors. And it'd be like, okay, I don't want early double pip stuff, but I think I can play, I think I can Thoughtseize on 1, play a Swords to Plowshares on 2, and then like I'm going to have double blue on turn 4, Like, but in general, you want to pretty heavily bias away from double pip cards.
Yeah, that's very reasonable. It's something in general I am just really doing in Magic anyway. I just find casting my spells much more like just being less greedy with your mana bases in generally is something that I've just tried to do just because I like casting my spells and I like playing Magic rather than looking at spells I can't cast.
I think one thing I've noticed with people who sort of come, because a lot of people come to Cube from Booster Draft, right? And very often in Booster Draft, you're playing with like a 9/8 mana base because there just isn't very much fixing. And people sort of take away from that a 9/8 mana base is like okay, and you can cast your spells with it.
No,
and it really isn't.
No,
like,
it's not. Yeah.
You get color screwed so much; it's horrendous. Like Cube, you have the fixing. You should really try for your mana to be way more consistent than that. And double pips make that a lot more difficult.
Actually, quick question on this, and actually this might go actually in the deck building part, but in these type of decks, James, how many lands are we playing? Because I'll be honest with you, if I'm playing a cube, my baseline nowadays is 16 lands, just because we have the ability to draft fetch lands and shock lands and this kind of stuff. So in theory, our mana is better than the split mana base we kind of touched on earlier. But like in these type of decks where you need to be hitting your colors much more consistently, how many lands traditionally would you be running in a deck like this that's wanting to splash or that's wanting to play all the colors basically?
And the thing is, like, even if your colors are really good and you could get away with fewer, often you do have a slightly higher curve in these decks, right? Because a lot of the cards you're stretching your mana base for are more towards the top end of your curve, right? So I'd say like my default is 17, but I'm not in any way married to that. And there's a lot of other cards that kind of count as lands, right? Like I'm counting the basic land cyclers as lands. I'm counting like Once Upon a Time as close to a land. That card's insane in 5-color, by the way. It goes way too late in every cube that exists in it. It's really strong. But yeah, I'd say like I have a rough default of 17, but I'm not opposed to going to 16.
The taking the lands is the eating the veg. It's eating your greens, the bread and butter. It is good and healthy for you. Let's talk about kind of the payoffs and kind of why we're doing this. So we mentioned some of these cards. So like things like Fourth Aelingus, Minsk and Boo, but kind of like there's powerful cards in multiple different types of cubes. Like let's chat about some awesome cards for a bit, James. A card like Fractured Identity, I think, sounds perfect for this kind of deck because yeah, it's a card that gets better later in the game when in theory your opponent has bigger things or has had more time to do their big broken thing, and then that is where Fractured Identity shines. It's basically you're undoing all the good work your opponent does by casting one spell. I'm assuming Fractured Identity is really strong in this type of environment.
Yeah, great place to be. And, no double pip, really powerful card at any stage of the game where you can cast it, gets better as the game goes on, and catches you up when you're behind.
Yes.
Like, it is often you've played some tap lands early, you might fall behind. Fractured Identity is so swingy, right? And it's and just works against everything. Like, I think when this card first came out, people saw him like, it's like a bit of a control magic. It's so much more than that, right? Because you get the ETBs, you're not getting wrecked by an unsummon when they or a disenchant where they play off control magic. Fractured Identity is great. It's a really good one to splash if you have access to one half of the mana.
And then, all right, a lot of people are going to love this card because the artwork is adorable, but this might be my most hated card in all of Magic, James. I think you know what I'm going to talk about. Comet Stellar Bloody Pup. I truly hate this card, but I know that this card is very good in this type of deck because it is, again, it's a 4-mana Planeswalker with RNG, with a roll the dice mechanic attached to it. This is another one that I know is very strong in these type of archetypes because you don't have to play this on turn 4. I mean, you can play it on turn 3. It's going to be very good, but like it is a slower card that you can play later in the game, and all you need to do is roll a 6 and you win the game. From my experience of it being played against me, anyway. I'm assuming this is another good one, James.
Yeah, Comet's great. I kind of agree with you. I think the card's nonsense in many ways, but it's very powerful. If you get it down early and it's unopposed, it will just snowball and win you the game. But even if it comes down later, it has a lot of loyalty, and it's most of the time, depending on what you roll, obviously. And the squirrels defend it for all that. The getting something back actually gets much better later in the game because you have more of a stocked graveyard, and nugging something is obviously great. So love Comet. Again, a card that you can often get late because it's a gold card. Not everyone's going to want it, and you can really take advantage of that.
Nice. And then another cool gold card that I think, this one's kind of definitely got a bit of a resurgence the last couple of years in Cube. In Fire Covenant. This seems also quite great because this seems just like a good way of catching you up in games. You can you don't need to cast this. Like, this isn't a card you want to cast on turn 3. Basically, this is kind of the point you're casting Toxic Deluge, I guess, if that makes sense. But because it's in 2 colors, it means you being the greedy color deck, you're more likely to be able to get it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a Toxic Deluge that doesn't kill your creatures, right? It's the card's really messed up, honestly. It's it's not going to be amazing in every game, but there are so many games of this card. You go from super far behind to winning in with one spell. And the fact it's an instant as well, it means it even beats up on haste creatures really nicely. Love Fire Covenant.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, there's so many cards we could talk about for this section, just because, again, it's kind of the best multicolored cards are some of the rewards you get for doing this archetype. But there are also cards that can be added to cube specifically for this archetype if you are trying to help out the 3, 4, 5 color deck. So we'll kind of touch on some of them now. One that kind of immediately springs to mind, James, it's also a card that kind of works in parallel with the wanting to run lots of fetch lands in your deck, and that's Omnath, Locus of Creation. That's the 4-color non-black Omnath that Trainwrecked through Standard probably like 4 or 5 years ago now. Got banned in a bunch of things, but that seems like a fantastic reward for being in multiple colors, because it is one of the most powerful multicolored cards probably ever printed, especially like in one-on-one anyway. I'm talking about. But yeah, Omnath seems like a great reward for this archetype. They're kind of like, effectively, if this is in your cube and you are the deck that is multicolored running all the colors, no one else is taking this. You are going to get this. Like, what do you think about Omnath, James?
Yeah, when it works, Omnath's very powerful. It is really a fetch land build around in a lot of ways. Like, if you don't have fetch lands, but you can cast it, I guess it's kind of fine, right? It's a 4-mana 4/4 that draws you a card and then will gain you some life, and that's fine. You can run that. But the games where you go like Omnath, play my fetch, crack my fetch, play a 5-drop, all in the same turn, like that's ridiculous, right? You got 9 mana spells worth L's out of your 5 mana. It gets really powerful when you have fetches, and then it's going to keep gaining you life as the game goes on as well. It's one you'll get very, very late because no one else can use it. Like, if you're in this deck and you see an Omnath in the first few picks of any pack, you're almost certainly not meant to take it, because you will wheel it. Just one to bear in mind.
And then let's actually talk about a mechanic that specifically rewards you for being in multiple colors, and that's Domain. We've seen Domain a bunch, and there's a ton of there are some very powerful cards in here. There's a lot of very mid-drafty chaff cards in here with Domain, but there are some very powerful ones. I think the most powerful one that I like the most, two actually, they're both removal spells. It's Leyline Binding and Prismatic Ending. Like, in this deck, you can easily make Leyline Binding cost a single white. Like, I've had this happen on turn 2, being able to just make 2 fetches to get 2 triomes. I can make Wooburg. Leyline Binding costing a single white and answering any non-land permanent is kind of wild. It also has Flash, so that's fantastic. And just like, and then Prismatic Ending is just a strong card anyway, like in a 2-3 color deck, as cards get cheaper and more efficient. But in this 5 color deck, where you can make those colors quite easily, it will just scale to the late game and just become a very, very solid removal spell.
Yeah, for sure. I think of the Domain cards, I think Leyline Binding is probably the most powerful, but just because it trades up on mana so well, right? Like, you could often have access to it early, but late game you can, when on turn 5 they play their 5-drop, you spend 1 mana as Leyline Binding it and then play a 4-drop. Like, that's such a huge swing. And it's so different from, like, there aren't other removal spells really in Cube that let you trade up on mana that far and hit everything, right? Not just creatures, it hits planeswalkers, it hits artifacts, enchantments, which means it's just good against everything, right? Other than like maybe the odd Storm deck, like, this is going to be great against every deck, right? You play against a Tinker deck, it's going to kill their portal. If you play against an Enchantress deck, it's going to blow up their key thing. It's Binding's a really nice reward for being here.
And then I guess you were talking about, you mentioned the word big creatures there. Let's talk about Scion of Draco. This is a 12-mana artifact creature dragon that is reduced in cost by Domain, and then gives your creatures a bunch of abilities if they're certain colors. So again, rewarding you for being in the multicolored deck by being a big top end for that deck. I will be honest, I have had this in my cube for a while. I don't think it's really popped off as much as I want it to, and I think that's possibly because there's just other like, yes, you can tinker for it, but generally, like, this really does want the domain deck to be a thing, and kind of like this is one where kind of like I think would work better in a cube where people aren't drafting their lands as aggressively, where you can make the domain archetype work. I think this is a very good payoff for that. But like this is a payoff that needs to be in that deck. A lot of the other things we've mentioned are cards that kind of like you can incidentally take and are awesome if you can cast them. This does really need to be a build around, basically. Is that fair, James?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a build around as well where you're never moving into the deck for Scion of Draco, right?
Yes,
that's not how it works. But if you're already there, this is a nice thing to get for free. Because when you're really enabling it, right, it's like a 2-mana 4/4 flyer that incidentally gives your other creatures some keywords, which can be good. But yeah, it's just very efficient when it works. But yeah, it's not one that you need to prioritize super high, I think.
I guess Scion is more like Omnath, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. Because and the other thing with Scion, right, you do really have to mean it for Scion. You know, you can't be like, oh look, I splashed a few cards and I theoretically have some land types. It's like, nah, you've got to be like pretty consistent every game. I'm assembling this stuff pretty quickly, but when you do it is powerful because the thing is, it's not like a 2-mana 4/4 flyer on turn 2 that often, but 2-mana 4/4 flyer stays powerful into the late game. You know, it lets you multi-spell really well. Like it lets you deploy a really powerful threat and hold up a counter spell, or deploy a threat and kill that guy on like turn 4 or 5, and that is pretty good. But yeah, not one you need to like take highly, but you'll get it for free, and if you really got that on your mana base, it'll make your deck and be good.
I think that's very fair. Let's talk about 3. I'm going to clump these together, even though I think one isn't like the others. In terms of like aggressive domain cards, we have cards like Territorial Kavu, Nishobi Brawler, and Rada's Firebrand. I kind of like the Kavu, but that's just because it has abilities when it attacks. Like it's a looter as well as just being like, all these cards are basically just big or can get big because you have multiple colors of lands, and that's kind of like cool. But as we've discussed, kind of like Rada's Firebrand is a 2-mana 3/1 in red that you can domain to make it bigger. Cool. I could run that, or I could run Inti, as we've already mentioned, like a card that's just individually strong rather than having to go like because part of the point of this deck is you are able to splash these cards. You don't, like, if you just want to curve out with an Inti into a Lalia, you can as well. Whereas with these kind of aggro, like everything we've discussed so far doesn't like if I curve out and beat someone down with good statted creatures, awesome. But that is not aggro. That's I think a strong differentiation there, James.
Yes, for sure. You can draft this deck and be like an assertive mid-range deck, absolutely, but you are not a all-in aggro deck basically ever. Yeah, I like the Kavu, but like the Brawler and the Firebrand, I don't think they're good enough for like high power cubes personally. No, I just find it's like, you do all the work and you get there and get like such a filler creature. And it's like, you know, even when I'm 5 color, I just had access to better cards in other colors, you know?
I think they're perfect for a budget cube proxying fixing.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds great.
I think that's spot on.
Yeah. The Kavu I do think is good though. Because the Kavu also like loots and is a little bit of graveyard hate. Just be careful that you don't have too many of the fixers which don't have types, right? Do not be actually like, I had an opponent in a Modo Cube earlier this season who went like Spire Bluff Canal, Copperline Gorge, put a Territorial Kavu into play, and it went to the graveyard. I was like,
it's a 0/0. Yeah.
My dude, I appreciate you have lots of colors of mana in play, but
you have drafted your
mistakes
land.
have been made here.
I guess that's how you can draft your lands wrong. But
yeah,
nice. Let's keep it going though, because those are kind of the domain cards. There's some other cool things you can do. I'm going to read this one because I don't think people will will probably know it, but there's a cool interaction that does, and that's Bring to Light. Bring to Light is a cool. It's 3 and a Simic for a sorcery with Converge. Converge is another mechanic that cares about the number of colors spent to cast it, but it's Converge. Search your library for a creature, instant, or sorcery card with mana value less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. Exile that card, then shuffle. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. So that's a nice little tutor. Again, if you're kind of one thing we haven't really touched on too much, but like if you are in 5 colors and there's a bunch of combos running around a cube, you are able to splash for different combo pieces, that kind of stuff. I mean, Kiki Jiki might be a bit tricky, but like I'm thinking like persist combos or other kind of creature-based combos, you could definitely splash with this. And Bring to Light is a solid tutor for that. But Bring to Light lets you go and get Valky, God of Lies. But the interaction with this is a little bit weird, or not weird, it kind of works how you want it to, because Valky on one side is 1 and a white for a 2/1 legendary creature god. But on the other side, it's a 7 mana planeswalker. And with Bring to Light, you can cast the 7 mana planeswalker side with Bring to Light. And that's pretty cool. 5 mana to go and cheat a 7 mana planeswalker out of your deck and put it into play. That's pretty good. That's as you do it. That is also a nice little. It's basically Bring to Light is a solid card. Valky is a solid card because on its front side, it's effectively a. I was going to say brain maggot, but there must be more iconic versions of that effect, James.
Mesmeric Fiend.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. It's a Mesmeric Fiend. It's a deep cavern bat style of card that is kind of not the most optimal one, but it's solid. But the fact that you can flip it with Bring to Light into this Planeswalker straight away, that's very powerful, is kind of cool. That's a nice little reward for those archetypes.
Yeah, Bring to Light's a nice one, and like does some good stuff even without Valky as well, right? It just gives you access, it gives you more copies of like situational cards in your deck that you might need, like you turn it into a sweeper and you need a sweeper or whatever. But yeah, the Valky interaction really puts it over the top for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then one that was very strong when it first got printed. Sorry, maybe very strong isn't the right way of saying this, but kind of like it was done a lot when it first got printed, and it does have the potential to be powerful. So powerful that it was banned in Commander, and that's Golos Tireless Pilgrim. I think the ban in Commander was more just homogeny in 5 color decks, actually. But just like Golos is a 5 mana colorless card that has a Wooburg and 2 activated ability to exile the top 3 cards of your library, and then you can play them without paying your mana cost. So it's a good reward in those kind of decks. It also tutors up a land on ETB, but it effectively can reward you for splashing all those colors by letting you cheat all the other big things that you've drafted into play. It is quite expensive. It is a bit slow. Again, this might be more one for the budgety type of decks, or budgety or like legacy kind of power level type of cubes that are kind of a bit slower and let you kind of really develop your resources and then do something big and dumb at the end. I should probably actually add this to my Treat Yourself cube, which is very much everything I've just described there. So maybe that's a point. And then another one that I think actually is a bit of a trap for this archetype, and that's Niv Mizzet Reborn. This is the Wooburg Niv Mizzet that enters, and you can reveal the top 10 cards. Then for each color pair, you can choose one and put them into your hand. That's not the type of reward we want from this. Kind of like it's another restriction. Kind of one of the like the restriction of this deck is that we have spent draft picks on our lands. We don't want more restrictions on top of that to make other cards work. We don't want to be, I drafted this awesome mana base. I've drafted a Niv Mizzet. Now I need 10 cards of each type. Is that fair, James? I never really got the fuss around Niv Mizzet Reborn, if I'm honest.
So I agree that this card isn't quite good enough in very powerful cubes anymore. But I think really the idea is you don't have to be hitting like 5 cards off this every time you play it, right? If you hit 2, you play to 5 mana 6/6 that drew you 2 cards. And like better than drew you 2 cards, right? Because your gold cards are going to be, it's not drawing you lands, it's drawing you action. And like 5 mana 6/6 for draw some cards is just pretty good. But I do kind of think that generally the juice is not worth the squeeze of, however your mana base looks, you're just not going to always have Wooburg on turn 5. And yeah, I just think there are other 5s you could be playing. But it's a cool card, and if your cube gives you a little bit more time, then I think it's okay, because it's you don't need to be like, I've got 12 gold cards in my deck, right? I think you can have 6 and be fine.
I guess it is an ETB as well, so if you cheated it somehow, You know what this is? This is the worst Atraxa.
It is quite a lot worse than Atraxa.
Yeah.
I'll give you that.
Nice.
I think vibier than Atraxa.
Yeah, that's fair.
But worse.
All right. You said vibey. The last one on this list, I'm assuming you added, is Tainted Pact? James? Talk to me about Tainted Pact, please.
Yeah, this is what I'm trying in my cube. I think it could be quite cool. So for those who don't know, Tainted Pact is 1 black for an instant. Says exile the top card of your library. You may put that card into your hand unless it has the same name as another card exiled this way. Repeat this process until you put a card into your hand or exile 2 cards with the same name, whichever comes first. So the joke with this card is that if you don't have any cards with the same name in your deck, then you can keep going as long as you want and either use it to tutor the card you need or combine it with something like a Thassa's Oracle and exile your whole library. It's kind of like a funky demonic consultation, right? And in Cube, we don't have multiple spells with the same name. We do almost always have multiple lands with the same name, right? Most decks will have a bunch of the same basic, and that kind of messes this up. But in a 5-color deck, it happens fairly frequently that you don't have more than one of any particular basic. Or, sometimes it might be like, normally I'd play 2, but I want to enable this, like 2 forests, but I want to enable this Tainted Pact, so I'll go down to 1 forest. I don't know if this is good enough, because but I think it could be cool to have another thing to do with your Thassa's Oracle that is kind of a payoff for a 5-color deck. I think that would be pretty sweet. I'm trying it out in my cube. We'll see if it works.
I am loving the 5-color Thassa's Oracle deck, James. It's
going to be so good. It's going to be so good. I'm really excited to draft it. It's I'll grant you it's narrow. It is narrow, but I think when it works, it'll be sweet.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's where we're going to end our discussion on being rewarded for drafting your lands, playing a bunch of colors. But it is a very unique style of deck because in theory your options are limitless. You're kind of like you can just play all the good stuff, and that's something that's really, really cool. All right, let's move it on to our final topic of the day, and that's what have we been playing. So last weekend we did your Powered Cube, James. It went kind of well for me, very well for you. You beat me in the final. You going 3-0, me going 2-1. I'll talk about my deck first because it does kind of tie in to this episode a little bit. I effectively had a deck similar to what we are discussing today. I think there's definitely something I definitely learned some stuff from today I can apply to the next time I do something like this. But the way my deck basically came together was I got a pick 2 Minsk and Boo and a pick 3 or 4 like Fractured Identity, and then the lands just kept coming around. So despite the fact that those are the colors I've mentioned, I was actually like a base white deck splashing red. So I had some very good removal. I had a Path, I had a Solitude, I had a Leyline Binding that was regularly 1 mana. And then in terms of my mana base for this, it came together pretty well, considering that I was very good in terms of what I was splashing. Effectively, I was a white deck with a couple of red pips, with my green splash only being Minsk and Boo and Morlock, and my only blue splash being Fractured Identity. But I had with a Windswept Heath and a Wooded Foothills, I had a Plateau, a Tropical Island, and an Endotha Triome. I didn't get mana screwed all day. I think that this was kind of borderline the archetype we're talking about today. I was rewarded by casting by being able to cast my spells, but wasn't able to go full. Like I did see an Omnath go round, but I didn't think I could commit fully. Effectively, mine was like a mid-range deck with a light touch of this. I think if I'd committed more and gone more into the lands earlier, I think I could have had a stronger overall deck. But I guess that's something that kind of from having this episode is something I can take to future drafts. James, do you want to tell the audience what you smushed me with in the final?
Yeah, I mean, my deck was sweet. I really enjoyed playing it, but I will also say I opened very well. I had I opened a Lotus and an Ancestral. I think it was Ancestral Pack 1, Pick 1, Lotus was pack 3, I think. Basically my draft was I first picked Ancestral, then took only Rakdos cards for the remainder of pack 1, because that is just what I was being passed. I ended up in a kind of cool, like, Grixis recurring nightmare opposition deck. It was a ton of fun, actually. So I had a bunch of ways to produce expendable tokens. Had like the 3 mana Duretti, I had Bitter Blossom, Seasoned Pyromancer, all that good stuff, Unorkish Bowmasters. And then I had 2 of the Evoke Elementals. I had Grief and Fury. So Nightmare, putting them in and out of play was great. Chaos Defiler was really the nuts in this deck.
Yeah, that card just gets better.
Yeah. It was a ton of fun. Then, I had the Mayhem Devil as well. Was like doing a lot of pinging around. Doing that and Fury, I was just like, felt like I could mow down the little creatures really well. And then opposition, I sort of just about had enough bodies to make that work. And there's only a couple of times do the full like lock them out of the game. Your lands are all tapped in your upkeep thing, which is. I mean, I enjoy it. I don't know about anyone else, but the deck played really well. Obviously, fortunate to open so well, but I think it came together into quite a nice build.
No, it was very cool. Yeah, it was a very, very cool deck, and yeah, a lot of fun to get. Was it the first in-person cube of the year?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it was. Yes.
Yeah,
well, we have another one coming up next weekend, so we'll report back on that in our next episode. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you all very much for listening. James, pleasure as always. Thank you for your insights there. You are the master of the 4/5 color. I'm not going to say pile, but the 4/5 color deck that actually synergizes annoyingly well. And I appreciate you talking through it with us today.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an archetype I enjoy drafting. I think it's sometimes seen as a bit of a bad guy, right? Because you're just playing all the busted cards. But I think there's actually a lot of nuance to how you draft it, and it's I think I find the decks play out really nicely if you get the right pieces.
Definitely, and it's definitely an archetype for people who like if you can get it working, you're doing cool and interesting things. Like the other decks just don't have the like you're combining cards that weren't really designed to be combined together by the person who built the cube. You're just kind of doing the best of all of it, and it's really cool when it comes together. And hope you can all give it a go the next time you all cube. But just a reminder, if you made it this far, please give the podcast a 5-star review, give it a thumbs up, whatever your podcast platform of choice allows you to give positive affirmation to. That would be wonderful. Tell a friend, all that good stuff. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, it's goodbye from James, and we'll see you all soon. Goodbye.